Good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's last post ceremony. My name is Lexa Peterson, and joining us today from the Royal Australian Navy is Captain Lisa Batchelor. Today, we remember the 105th anniversary of the Boonah Tragedy. In just 4 years, some 10 million military personnel and 7 million civilians died in the First World War. Australia's share of the death toll was nearly 62,000 service personnel, including 25 nurses. As if 17 million deaths was not enough, towards the end of the conflict, a deadly disease broke out that would greatly add to the death toll. War often creates perfect conditions for outbreaks of disease, and this time it would be on a scale like no other. The influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1920, nicknamed the Spanish flu because reports of it first came from that country, would go on to claim some 50 million deaths worldwide, in half the time the war had taken. It is thought to have first emerged in army camps in the United States in early 1918, but more recent research indicates that the virus, or at least a precursor virus that jumped from birds to livestock to humans, was likely circulating among Allied troops in France as early as December 1916. Symptoms usually began with a sore throat, headache and fever. If it took hold, it could kill within a few days, sometimes hours, due to severe hemorrhages and build-up of fluid in the lungs. Once bacterial pneumonia set in, death would soon follow. It was a horrible way to die. All told, 1,238 Australian soldiers died of influenza pandemic during the war. After it reached Australia at the end of 1918, it is estimated some 40% of the population became infected over the next 2 years, resulting in 15,000 deaths. Shortly, we will hear the story of one individual who lost his life to the pandemic while serving his country in time of war. We welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that love and support them. The live stream of this ceremony is made possible by the Returned and Services League of Australia and the RSL and Services Clubs Association. We welcome members who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony across Australia. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the pool of reflection by visitors to the memorial. If you're able, please stand and join in singing the National Anthem.
Australians, oh, let us rejoice, for we are one and free. We've golden soil and wealth for toil. Our home is got by sea. Our land abounds in nature's gifts of beauty, rich and rare. In history's page, let every stage advance Australia fair. In joyful strains, then let us sing, advance Australia fair.
If able, please be seated. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where family and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight, we will read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 103,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and on operations for more than a century. But first, we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths or floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the pool of reflection.
Today we remember and pay tribute to Private Joseph Clatworthy. Joseph was born in March 1897 in Esperance, Western Australia. He was the second child of Robert Clatworthy, a shepherd, and his Aboriginal wife Maggie. Following the death of his mother in 1904, Joseph was placed in the Swan Native and Half-Caste Mission along with his siblings Robert and Lily. Joseph completed his schooling on the mission before going to work at the age of 16. As a ward of the state, a portion of his wages was retained by the mission. In 1917, he was paid an amount of £13, 5 shillings and 8 pence by the manager of the mission for the money he was owed. Joseph was an active sportsman, playing for the Greenough football team while working in the area. Joseph Clatworthy enlisted in the Australian Imperial Force on the 12th of July 1918, 4 months after his 21st birthday. It was his second attempt at enlisting. His first attempt had been rejected because of an illness. He gave his occupation as dairy hand and horsebreaker on his attestation and listed his permanent address as the Swan Native and Half-Caste Mission, Joseph was the last man from the mission to enlist in the war. By 1918, the military permitted Indigenous men with one European parent to enlist, though Western Australia retained some of the most stringent restrictions on Aboriginal war service. Despite these restrictions, Joseph's second enlistment was successful. He was appointed to the 3rd General Service Reinforcements at Black Boy Hill on the 22nd of July with the rank of private and started his initial training. Private Joseph Clatworthy departed Fremantle on the 29th of October 19 in HMAT Boonah, the last ship to leave Australia with servicemen bound for the Western Front. The ship arrived in Durban in South Africa on the 13th of November, 2 days after the armistice had been signed. It was ordered to return to Australia. While replenishing supplies, local stevedores from Durban brought pneumonic influenza, known as the Spanish flu, onto the ship from the illness-stricken city. On the return voyage to Australia, the Boonah experienced harsh weather conditions that forced the 918 men on board to spend significant time below decks in cramped quarters. The commanding officer of HMAT Boonah warned his counterpart in HMAT Warima, which had departed South Africa ahead of Boonah, that an increasing number of men aboard the ship were suffering from pneumonic influenza. By the time the ship arrived back in Fremantle on the 12th of December 1918, more than 300 cases of influenza had been reported on the ship. Already aware of the pandemic spreading globally, Commonwealth immigration authorities initially refused to allow any soldiers to disembark from the ship. Eventually, authorities granted permission for the unwell soldiers to be brought ashore at Woodman's Point Quarantine Station. It took 3 days for the tugboat Alliance to bring all 337 men to the station, including Private Joseph Clatworthy. There followed 9 days of tense debate, during which the returned soldiers and sailors Imperial League of Australia threatened to storm the Boonah and liberate the confined men. But finally the ship was permitted to sail to Adelaide. At Woodman's Point, military nurses and doctors were supported by 20 civilian nursing sisters who volunteered to help treat the ill men. The outpouring of offers was so immediate, despite the risks, that names had to be drawn out of a hat to select the 20 nurses. 4 nurses would die at Woodman's Point while trying to treat the soldiers. At Woodman's Point, Joseph's condition continued to deteriorate. He died of pneumonic influenza on the 23rd of December 1918. He was 21 years old. Joseph's remains were originally buried at the cemetery at Woodman Point Quarantine Station, along with the bodies of 26 other soldiers and the 4 nurses who also died of influenza as a result of the Boonah Tragedy. In 1958, his remains were exhumed and reinterred at the Perth War Cemetery at Karrakatta. His Commonwealth War Graves headstone contained a small inscription by his sister Lily. "In the midst of life, we are in death. Rest in peace." Joseph's name is also listed on the Roll of Honour on my right, among almost 62,000 Australians who died while serving in the First World War. A photograph of his headstone is displayed today beside the pool of reflection. This is but one of the many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Private Joseph Clatworthy, who gave his life for us and for our freedoms in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the reading of the Ode and sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
lest we forget.
Lest we forget. We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozieres or in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over, but in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes the last post ceremony. On behalf of the director, staff and volunteers, thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial today and for your continued support during the memorial's development project. We wish you all a very pleasant evening.